This is my favorite Dutchman, Joost Elffers.
Hello.
What do you have to say?
20 years ago, my wife Betsy and I bought a house next door to his mother. And because I'm an artist's son, and she was too, we related immediately and we became very close friends. I also befriended her two sons. As a Dutchman, living already for 32 years in New York, half my life, I feel my Dutch identity in a very intense way. And one of the building blocks of my Dutch identity is Piet Mondriaan, met dubbel E. He says Mondriaan from Paris, in Mondriaan in New York. Nee, Piet Mondriaan. At our breakfast table, my artist wife, I always teach Dutch artist names. No, Rembrandt van Rijn. Rembrandt van Rijn. Vincent van Gogh. Piet Mondriaan. Very important to me because Mondriaan is one of the building blocks of my being. When I was asked to speak with my friend Sandy about Mondriaan and Calder here, I said, but I am not an art historian. I can't say anything. I have no base for that. But then, over the weeks going here, it slowly grew on me that I had a lot to say about Piet Mondriaan. Because what I said already, it is a building block of my existence, of my DNA, of my identity. How is that possible that the style, and Mondriaan in particular, is so close to me? I started to read a great book made here, the style, Mondriaan and the style. And they did something in that book what I really approved of. They had very big the birthday of each artist involved. And I immediately saw, and it is one of my theories, because I always look when somebody was born, that Mondriaan was born a generation and a half earlier than Van Doesburg, for instance. He is even from the 1872. So he was 28 years old in 1900. Why is that so important? Because the style exhibit I saw in the 80s in the Museum, I was stunned by the difference in quality of Mondriaan and the rest of the style group.
All of them?
All of them, because Mondriaan is absolutely pure. His quest for not only excellence but for the divine is absolute.
Wait a second.
Absolute.
Divine?
Yes.
Like spirituality?
Yes.
No, Dutch people do not think Mondriaan is spiritual.
And that is also why I talk so much about 1872. He is a man from the 19th century. There were, as a young man, table dancing, the Annie Besant with the Theosophical Society, later Rudolf Steiner and Krishnamurti. He went to these lectures a lot. And then I see that the Dutch art historians for a long time had enormous problems with the influence of these spiritual and mystical sources he was seeking after a very narrow Protestant ocean, in Pier and Ocean, and way went beyond in his personal language than somebody like Rudolf Steiner. I made a book in the 70s, Rudolf Steiner und seine Architektur, and I spent a few weeks in Dornach, and the crappy expression of the anthroposophical art is so disgusting compared to my god and hero Mondrian, who found his own language, of a spiritual language, of a totally original way, and he, although he had these similar goals in a philosophical way, he surpassed in expression them, well, in a way you even don't want to talk about it anymore. Now, what is the problem we have to discuss? And the problem Sandy has with explaining his grandfather. They met in 1931. October 1930 in the studio of Mondrian. And this spiritual high priest of abstract art, Mondrian, this playful, and you hate the word, open-minded young artist, your grandfather, who is totally alive and in the world, who enjoys life in an earthy way. They said before, Mondrian liked to dance, so did Calder. But Mondrian danced like an autistic nerd. You have to see in the 20s, where there was money, there was decadence, there was a nightlife in Paris, and we know a little more what a nerd is now, but then he was, in his communication skills, stifled. So he was famous that he could dance, but then the architect said, he dances geometric. His grandfather, and I know it from his mother, because his mother, who was a big woman, could dance on jazz like her father. But that was in an earthy way, before or after a great meal she cooked. Mondrian had not that chance. I mean, Mondrian in his studio would sleep in this little bed, and he had Josephine Baker as a dream, as a photo of him. And he probably still had problems to keep his hands above. Because that is what his mother said.
Oh my goodness.
So the two dancers are so far apart and so close by. And the whole thing, and we should stop talking about Mondrian, because Mondrian doesn't have to be explained, really. The only thing I really would like to say about the mystical part of the 19th century, don't forget that Annie Besant and the group around that, they were busy in the late 19th century with meditational models on abstract art. And the art was made in a natural way with the sun or something what would burn or so. It should not be touched by hand. And directly from that research of meditating on an abstract plane came the Rorschach test in 1921. And the Rorschach test is really a mirror to reflect the unconscious of the audience. Then my friend Mark Mitten said, but there was even 2 centuries earlier a mystic in England, John Dee, and he had a mystical part from Mondrian were not only the kitschy part of the religious beliefs, they were also the meditation on abstraction. But my big question to Sandy is, and that is, I think, the core of our conversation, is that when I met his family, they were down on Picasso. How is that possible? Are you down on Picasso? They said, because there are so many dark elements. My father, his mother said, my father was about happiness and engaging the world. And then my wife said, yes, it is easier to make a difficult painting than a happy painting, so a happy artwork is very hard for Calvinist cultural people to accept as a serious artwork. So for me, say Sufi stories come to mind, where you just don't know who the master is. It can be the servant, it can be the man who's always smiling, it is always somebody else. So I think that the genius of Calder is that he made masterpieces who were happy. And that is rare in art history.
I'm enjoying this very much. So, I grew up hating the word play. People always talk about Calder as being an artist of play and joy. And I grew up in the 60s and 70s in New York, in our art culture of New York, and where my grandfather, at the end of his life, he died in '76, was dismissed as a playboy, as not a rigorous intellect. And I began our family foundation in 1987, partly due to this fact that I was very, very frustrated that in 1931, Fernand Léger wrote an introduction to a catalog of Calder exhibition, the first actually exhibition of Calder's abstract works, and he said, he compared Calder to Eric Satie and Marcel Duchamp. And by 1971, Calder wasn't in reference to any of these other intellectual geniuses. And it was a great sadness of mine growing up that people just saw color and form and motion, those three. These are four-letter words in my family, color, form, and motion. If you understand Calder as color, form, and motion, you do not understand Calder. And so joy, and especially play was the great four-letter word. Anytime somebody wrote or said play for Calder was very objectionable. We did this symposium a couple of years ago now at the University of Virginia, which was all scientists. There was a mechanical engineer and an astronomer and all these different scientists, physicists and so on. Each of them were presenting their ideas as it relates to Calder, their own particular discipline. They're all connected to Calder because Calder's about energy. And one of the scientists started talking about play. And I became very annoyed at this concept of play, 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 play. Then he said, play equals innovation. And I realized that play, in the dismissive sense of we don't need to look at Calder because he's not serious, was in contrast to this genius scientist's definition, was so remarkable. It reminded me about the feminists who took their own word. Can I say that word? Yeah. They took their own word, cunt, this terrible word in English, and they took it and possessed it and owned it, and they used it. And same in African American culture in America. They use this terrible word that white people can't say, and they call each other this terrible word. They possess the word. They take the power of the word. And I realized I have an opportunity to take play and make it my own, and then present play as Calder's innovation, and to present where Calder's genius in talking to Joost, I realized that my own sense of Mondrian was different growing up than most of the people around me. Most of the people around me thought that Mondrian's rigid geometry, quote unquote, was this rational, possessive, a little bit bizarre, autistic was a good word, presentation of a theory, not realizing that, in fact, Mondrian's work is incredibly deeply emotional. And when the Museum of Modern Art did a show now 10, 15, 12 years ago, they showed all these drawings, and they showed an analysis of the paintings and how those lines had been moved a half a millimeter over this way or that way and painted again and again and again to find the perfect harmonic definition of existence. Something entirely different than x times 2 equals 3 and 5, put a line here. Entirely different. So when Yves Saint Laurent made his evening dress with the supposed geometry of Mondrian and dismissed the emotion and the actual deeper genius of Mondrian and put it on a dress, when I was a kid, which was in the 60s, I was so repulsed that Yves Saint Laurent was able to do that and that that was acceptable. I was a strange child, right? So in our discussion, I was reliving and learning more about the sadness I had about both of these great emotional and intellectual geniuses, and how there's been now, I'm sure no one here agrees with me about this point about, you all know Mondrian, of course, as a genius, but in New York, when I was growing up, that was not the attitude about the artist.
Yes,
I mean,
it was, just not your thing.
no, you're wrong, Pat.
No, you're wrong.
He was completely and utterly, he had almost evaporated. Okay, there were a couple of intellectuals and these special people like Pat here that had a deeper understanding about Mondrian, but culturally, and I don't mean people who don't know anything about art, but culturally, there was a disregard of Mondrian. Your turn.
For me, Mondrian is just, was always there, so I have absolutely no recollection of that.
Yes, but you and Pat both hated Calder.
Well, the thing is,
Hate's a big word.
yeah, hate is not the word, but
Disregard.
didn't regard it as highly as we do now.
He didn't change. You changed.
Of course, he couldn't change. He wasn't big. But,
By the way, ask any questions. Sam, you have a question, I know. Ask any questions. It's an engaged conversation. There's a question.
Yes, sir. There was a mentioning of you when you showed this on your performance on your talk, this postcard was so humanitarian. And my question is, and you said that something happened. It was in 1953 or something. And my question really is, do you consider your grandfather to have been a mystic?
No, it was not a mystic at all. He was alive, he was earthy, he was dealing with gravity, in my opinion.
My grandfather was a devoutly non-religious spiritual person. In terms of being a mystic, absolutely yes and no. He was able to tap into something that had not been expressed before him and present it, but it's something that it's made out of metal, but it's incredibly ephemeral because it's not really made out of metal at all. His mobiles, which are sheet metal, wire, and paint, exist in space, and it's the immaterial aspect of the work which is the work of art. The genius of Calder is at the intersection of the plane of metal and the surface of the air, the surface of the non-existent, right? That is the genius of Calder. And as it moves through space and the changing composition and your personal experience in real time, that's his genius. Is that mystical? I don't know. It's, I never took any kind of religious studies, so I don't know if mysticism has a precise definition. Joost knows better.
Well, it would be the definition of the artist. I don't think that artists like to think that way.
André Breton included Calder in many, many exhibitions of surrealism, but he never considered himself a surrealist. In fact, he wrote to his dealer, Pierre Matisse, Henri Matisse's son, was Calder's dealer for about 10 years in New York, and on the top of his stationery, it described different kinds of abstract painting and primitive art and different things he was selling, and Calder didn't fit the definition of any of these things. Later, he was describing some works to a curator, and he drew some drawings of the works to describe them. You know, sort of photography was too complicated. And he wrote he said that a particular work of 1936 was rather sewer realist. Sewer is where all the poop goes. So he made fun of all those definitions. He never would have said anything as audacious as him being. Follow-up question.
One more question. What is the function of this line of energy? You said that once or twice, and you pointed out in one of these mobile.
My grandfather was exploring something quite entirely his whole life, his whole career. It begins with the motion of that duck, which is the essential basis of life and all things. So he very easily, as a child, moved into the fourth dimension. That was easy for him. He preconceived the fourth dimension in his head as a child. So by the time he was up and running as an artist, he was describing the 8th and 9th dimensions. Now we talk about the 13th dimension, string theory, the unifying force. Calder's trying to describe something, both intuitively and through his own process, about these energetic forces. In 1931, he makes abstract sculpture about a description of energy, a non-scientific description. And by 1934, in order to understand Calder, people write, he is describing the universe, the sun, the moon, the earth, orbiting bodies. That's as best as people could understand what he was trying to describe. He wasn't describing the universe, he was describing a universe, he was describing Calder's universe, which is an attempt to bring together all these different harmonics of energy, of experience. So, you cannot see gravity. We can argue about whether you can feel gravity or not. That's, you know, you can't see wind, but you can see the effect of these things, and you can sometimes feel the effect of these things. He was very interested in things beyond the five senses. He was not a mystic, but I would say he was mystical. More questions?
Yeah. Excuse me, I'm always a little bit secondary in my reactions, so excuse me in advance. You showed Hercules and the lion. And when I was seeing that statue, I immediately thought about the paintings of Picasso, who had in the 20s the same classical ideas, and I recognized his way of making lines. Has there been any connection, any relation between Picasso and your grandfather? Because you were telling he was making dark pictures and so on.
Paris.
Yeah.
Being in Paris.
Actually, I didn't say I don't like Picasso and he makes dark pictures.
His mother said
My mother said that to you. My mother also would never say a bad sculpture by her father was a bad sculpture. I can easily say, that's a terrible sculpture by my grandfather, and here's a great sculpture by it. It's I'm much more dispassionate. Some people have written about Picasso and Calder, and you know, quite a few people have written about Picasso and everybody.
Yes, that's right.
So it's very easy to dissect in hindsight. You can put up an image. So Calder made a bronze sculpture in 1944 with a big foot. It's before Giacometti made his big feet. But Giacometti didn't see the Calder and then make his own. This was the resolution of a problem. The problem is, how do you get this tall form to remain upright? You need to create a lot of mass at the bottom to keep it upright. So, Picasso made his monument to Apollinaire, which is drawings in a sketchbook, before Calder made wire sculpture. Calder never saw Picasso's drawings of this monument, which was never created except much, much later, in retrospect. certainly their effects. There's no specific dialogue and there's no specific discussion, like we have with this actual example of Calder in Mondrian's studio and the effect of the studio on the artist. We had a great talk this morning with the architect who recreated Mondrian's studio and put it into the exhibition, so you get the sense of what it was like for Calder. And he was describing how the studio, which has 5 walls, is the intersection of 2 cubic spaces. And having known my grandfather very well, I know that his response to these 2 cubic spaces was almost a visceral thing, where we walk in and we just see some colored rectangles on the wall and some rugs and some things. Mondrian's solution to this terrible problem, how do you paint in a room with 5 corners? As someone said this morning, he makes paintings with 4 corners. How do you do that in a room of 5 corners? It's difficult. He resolved it by making a 4-cornered space and an additional 4-cornered space in the 5-cornered space. Okay? So those kinds of descriptions we don't have for Picasso or for his experience with art, with Kandinsky, with clay. We know that all these artists have an influence on Calder because we can experience in the work. A great exception to this, there's been a lot of discussion with scholars about Miro and Calder, that Calder influenced Miro, Miro influenced Calder, and in fact they have a tremendous parallel resonance, both having come from art and Kandinsky and clay and so forth. Miro's grandson, who's a dear friend of mine, wrote a whole essay kind of debunking this notion about Miro and Calder and presenting this sort of resonance back and forth throughout their careers and their lives. That was something very nice because it was a very well-considered description of this relationship. But so, back to your question, there's nothing specific about Picasso.
He could draw better than anybody else, Picasso.
Yeah, but he made the same idea. He also made Hercules and the Lion and things like that in the same period. That was my question.
Was it after he came to the Calder exhibition or before?
Ask him.
Time, there's a veil of time. Time itself gives a subject to people. People can see certain things at certain times and not at others. You speak louder.
Pat's saying that historical retrospect, she's calling it a veil of time, I'm changing her words, give us a lot more, give both a true and a false representation of history. So the great thing about this exhibition is that it's based upon personal experience that can be decoded and we can take certain facts, we'll call them facts for lack of a better word, maybe they're not so perfect, but they're facts, and we can elaborate upon those facts with other things we know today and try and build a circumstance that happened in October 1930. It's you know, how accurate are we? We're not really sure. The representation of the studio in the exhibition is Mondrian's studio of 1926. Calder arrives in that space in October 1930, 4 years later. So it's not precisely what Calder saw. The back wall, the largest wall in the studio, is the wall that Calder saw in the diagram, the thing that was called a postcard, is a diagram of the colored rectangles on the wall with cross-light, and those colored rectangles could be repositioned for compositional experiments by Mondrian. So Calder describes exactly 1930, but we see 1926, so it's a little bit of a challenge, but it's much harder to make a studio of 1930, I propose, than it is to show, because there's much more documentation of 1926. Is that correct? Yeah. I'm asking the expert here in the front. Yes. He agrees.
But when you step into this replica of the Mondrian studio here in the exhibit, we bring ourselves in there, and people say we visited it, but then people forget to go imagine that you are Mondrian standing there, and then through the window, the door, you see his dream of his painting in the world out, in the show, the real thing.
it also gives us at the Calder Foundation a real challenge because we still possess Calder's studio of 1933. The actual building, the actual tools, the actual materials on the floor all exist as he left it. And we have the struggle of what do we do precisely with this? How do we present that? With Brancusi, they took his studio apart, they transported it, Renzo Piano made a building, and they try and replicate the sensation you have in going around the exterior, looking through the walls of Brancusi's studio, and even so much as to paint these gray shapes on the wall of things that were there, which are no longer there. And it's a very difficult subject, how you present the artist's space. Us having the actual space and the actual tools and the actual materials is, it's very difficult for us to know how to present it and how to give access to that, because we have tens of thousands of people that want to come tomorrow to see that. It's still a private place. So seeing this recreation of the studio and all the other examples around the world, both good and bad, of an artist's space, a workspace, and access, and that kind of personal experience of the viewer is very helpful to us.
But
so,
we, the audience, love to see these spaces.
Yeah.
Also the reconstruction, they are maybe a little flat, a little fake, they are still they inspire us. I mean, in the rest of this, there is here a whole department of doll houses and models in this museum. We are drawn to doll houses from the 17th and 18th century. We love them. It is a similar thing with an artist studio recreation. You should not, out of purity and puritanical perfection, deny the audience that pleasure forever.
Okay. Any further questions for us before we let everyone go about their way?
Yeah. Did anyone before your grandfather make any mobiles at all?
So, the precedence of not motion, but mobiles in advance of Calder. I mean, you can go back to China a couple thousand years ago, and there are things that respond to wind and make chimes and make music and make sound. That certainly existed way in advance of Calder. There are plenty of examples. I mean, Man Ray made an object. It's a room divider of a coat hanger, and then 2 coat hangers, and then 4 coat hangers, and then 8 coat hangers. Many of you know this thing through Man Ray's own photograph. That was, really unrelated to mobiles, and that had a functional purpose. But the answer is no. Nobody made mobiles in that sense before Calder. There were some suspended, Namgabo made a few suspended objects that could rotate. So neoplastician kind of things where there's plexiglass, I mean you all know this works, plexiglass intersections with these wires that create these volumes. But they're very, very static, except this, subtle rotate quality.
If my recollection is right, I once flew that was in March '77, in a plane from New York to Buenos Aires, which was, at the outside was painted by your grandfather from Aerolíneas Argentinas. Can you confirm that he did that kind of things? It was wonderfully painted, and it moved very fast.
I'm glad you brought that up. Braniff Airways was a small, aggressive, sort of like Virgin Atlantic thing, full of new ideas and so on. And they hired this advertising agency in New York to come up with an idea to bring attention to their craft. And they sent this ad guy over to meet my grandfather in France from New York. And he had no idea what he was going to ask Calder, no idea about really anything. And in the airport, he bought a plastic model of an airplane on his route to visit Calder. And sort of developed this idea of getting him to do something. They didn't really know. And given the possibility of painting the outside, this is a time when Salvador Dali was famous for being on television selling toothpaste. I mean, it was a time where, you know, the artist was celebrity and all these different kinds of things. Warhol was starting to become quite popular and so on. This is 1973 was the first one. So they came up with this idea of having him paint the plane. It wasn't his idea. And they wanted to promote it in advertising and all that kind of stupidity by saying his biggest mobile and all that kind of thing. But he liked the idea of decorating an airplane. I mean, it was quite a challenge. My grandmother was absolutely against the idea and thought it was undignified. But she was a proper Bostonian. My grandmother was the great niece of Henry James, and she was a bohemian because of her husband, and previously had been very proper. And she just thought it was really kind of a vulgar and terrible thing. But he tried it, and he did. He actually made 3 planes for Braniff. The first one's the best one, probably the one you were on. It was very colorful. The second one was the flying colors of the United States for the bicentennial in 1976, right? Which is the year he died. And then he did a third design, which was never realized, but he had finalized it by the time he died.
And his wife hated the second one even more,
yeah.
With the flag of America.
Yeah, because they were very much against the Vietnam War. My grandmother was really politically very active and very vocal. And so the idea of this patriotic project, red, white, and blue on a plane, was even more disgusting than the first one. And you may also know the BMW motor car, which in 1975, BMW saw this plane and thought, oh my God, we have to have him paint a car, that would be so exciting. So he painted a car in 75, and he did it sort of in secret, because he felt kind of bad about the airplane thing. And that was the beginning of their whole art car series. Now BMW has this long tradition of having great artists make these terrible cars.